I'm about to show you why we already have ironclad proof that Bigfoot exists. And this isn't coming from me. It's coming from a PhD anthropologist and anatomist with decades of field experience. He's uncovered proof that certain pieces of Bigfoot footage, and more specifically, the matching footprints, are scientifically impossible to fake.
Is it safe to say that the details in the footprints that we've been discussing absolutely confirm beyond the shadow of a doubt the existence of the Sasquatch species?
Yes, it does.
But even more shocking than that, he has first-hand knowledge of authentic Sasquatch hair samples that were deliberately omitted from major studies.
Early on, there were complaints that samples that had been submitted were never acknowledged, their receipt was never acknowledged, and then they weren't cited in the study.
My name is Robert. I'm a Canadian filmmaker and researcher, and I'm sure I never would have been going down this Bigfoot rabbit hole if I hadn't had my own encounter with a Sasquatch in September 2024. Ever since then, I've been absolutely obsessed with finding out the truth about these mysterious beings. The whole truth, no matter how uncomfortable that might make some people. That's why it was such a privilege to sit down for an interview with one of the few highly credentialed scientists who takes the subject of Bigfoot seriously. I'm talking, of course, about Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Not only is he a PhD anthropologist, anatomist, and expert in primate locomotion, but he's also a professor of anthropology at Idaho State University. Dr. Meldrum has arguably spent more time than anyone else on the planet studying all the details of the scientific evidence for Sasquatch. And it turns out there's a whole lot of that evidence to study.
I want to thank you, first of all, very much, Dr. Meldrum, for taking the time to meet with me. It's a real honor to be talking with you. I'm kind of geeking out right now, to tell you the truth.
Well, hopefully it'll live up to expectation.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah. Before we get into the heavy stuff, the details of the evidence and addressing common skeptical claims that I'm sure you've been dealing with for many years, I wanted to ask, when you started your career and became an anthropologist, did you see yourself becoming probably the world's foremost expert on 18-inch long hair-covered footprints?
No, I did not. And in fact, my landing on a career path was a very tortuous and circuitous route. And I actually had always toyed with this notion of becoming a veterinarian. Fascinated with animals, obviously, from a very young age. I was steeped in all things natural history, whether it was insect collection. I had my own little menagerie of animals, both furry and scaly and multi-legged. In our room was like a little zoo, as well as the natural history collections with skulls and bones and fossils and wasp nests and bird nests and all kinds of things. As my interest began to focus, and I had a more specific interest in physical anthropology and human evolution, and especially the fossil record of human evolution, was capturing my attention time and time again. The comparative anatomy, the functional morphology, the paleontology, the human evolutionary discussion was just, epitomized everything that I was so fascinated with. Well, for me, you can trace it back to 1968, when Roger Patterson showed up in Spokane, Washington, where I was living. And he had shown the film at the University of British Columbia, at the Smithsonian. Scientists had opined, for the most part, it was thumbs down, this is fantasy. It was contrary to their expectations of how human evolution occurred, how bipedalism evolved, and so forth and so forth. I mean, they had their reasons, but they were not very good reasons. And even the rational, reasonable reasons have since been completely thrown out the window, been negated by new knowledge, by new discoveries in the fossil record. But he took his program on the road, and Spokane was one of his first stops. And so I remember, seeing that advertisement in the newspaper, convincing my dad. I never heard of Bigfoot. This was the first exposure to the notion of Bigfoot. I thought, what is this? So, of course, my dad took me and my younger brother. That set the ball rolling. But even then, as you phrased it, who could have imagined that I'd be sitting here talking to you about this very subject. I mean, at that point, it was 11-year-old boys. It was just excitement, adventure, thrills of the mystery, the unknown, exploration.
I find that all of us, whether highly qualified scientists like yourself or just regular guys interested in Bigfoot like me, who have a deep-seated interest in learning the truth about all this, have had something in our childhood that stands out. Very often it is the Patterson-Gimlin film,
Sure. Yeah.
I find, in probably the majority of cases. But I want to fast forward some years from the impact that the film had on you as a child. You're a relatively newly minted anthropologist, and a series of events transpired that put Bigfoot on your radar, not as a matter of general interest, but as a matter of serious study in your field of expertise. Can you tell us, kind of in order, what that series of events was that led you to take this seriously?
Right. Well, it was a bizarre string of events. It came about in part just by the serendipity of certain associations, certain circumstances. We actually did a unit on primates for science in 6th grade, and the teacher was coaxing from us characteristics that define the order of primates. What set monkeys and apes apart from other mammals, and then a list of exemplary species that would be contained within that order. And someone, I can't remember the person's name, but he was being flipped, raised his hand and said, Bigfoot, as an example of a primate. And the class laughed, and then, but rather than just blowing it off, brushing it aside, to her credit, I say that repeatedly to her credit, Mrs. Davis said, well, how do the eyewitnesses describe Bigfoot? And then, of course, all the volunteers and people who'd seen the movie, and she was listing those or just ticking off the ones that we had already listed, rather. Yes, okay, each one of those is associated with our description, our definition of a primate. So if Bigfoot exists, it probably would be a large primate, wouldn't it? The seeds had been planted. I was the type of student and scholar who, when an opportunity is laid on your doorstep or in your path, you take advantage of it. You make the most of it. And so then when Greenwell had an opportunity to investigate a piece of video footage that depicted a Sasquatch, because he asked me, he said, well, you're interested in primates. You're the anthropologist. What do you think about Bigfoot? And I go, well, by that time, the interest over the years had kind of waxed and waned, and it was kind of in a waning period where not a lot had happened. Nothing was really in the headlines, no new breakthroughs. It was just kind of more of the same old. And it seemed like it was just stalled out, that it just was going to remain an unresolved mystery. And I kind of expressed that. He said, well, should any new evidence come to light, would you be interested? Well, of course. I mean, who wouldn't? And so sure enough, literally like 2 months later, I get this call. And the short of it is there was a piece of video footage known as the Redwoods video, sometimes affectionately referred to as the Playmate video.
By the way, if you're enjoying this content and you want lots more of the deepest dives, the most logical analysis, and the most paradigm-shifting Bigfoot evidence brought to light, then hit that subscribe button and notification bell. I've also recently launched a new Cabin in the Woods Patreon where you can connect with me and the evidence a whole lot more directly and intimately, and the first tier of membership is 100% free. I'll tell you more about it at the end of the video.
And so that sucked me in. I thought, oh, this will just be a fun exercise at this point. I thought, because I was a student of primate locomotion and comparative anatomy. Who better to take a look at this film and say, oh, there's the zipper, and it doesn't move right, and limb proportions are completely, inconsistent with other models of locomotion. I thought this would just be a fun exercise to ply my craft. Problem was, I couldn't see a zipper. And in fact, I was noticing interesting features the basis, the seed for the midtarsal break. The notion of the midfoot flexibility was the result of an observation made on this subject as it stepped off of the roadbed into the undergrowth on the side of the tree line. So that was another nexus point.
Quick pause here because I know what you're probably thinking. Robert, are you honestly expecting us to believe that this blurry black and white video, where you can't see much of anything, is the video that convinced Dr. Meldrum as a young anthropologist to take the subject of Bigfoot seriously? And honestly, fair point. But a few things to keep in mind. First of all, when Dr. Meldrum watched it, it hadn't been converted from tape to digital. It hadn't been copied and recopied and bootlegged a dozen different times. And as a result, the version he saw was a whole lot higher quality than what I've been able to show you here. This is the highest quality version I could find online, but when Dr. Meldrum saw it, he was able to discern a whole lot more detail. You may also be wondering, where's the undeniable proof of Bigfoot that I promised you at the beginning of the video? Why all the backstory? Well, the undeniable proof is coming, I promise, but I feel Dr. Meldrum's journey, or at least a condensed version of it, is important to share first because it shows that he didn't just enter this space as some crazed Bigfoot nut with a bad case of confirmation bias. He entered this as a serious anthropologist and anatomist, a scientist whose only goal was to get to the truth, and he was gradually persuaded over the years by various pieces of evidence that these beings exist and that that existence is undeniable. So stick with me on this journey, and we'll follow Dr. Meldrum as he made these discoveries, which cumulatively led him to his current conviction that the proof is there.
And then realizing an opportunity to visit Dr. Krantz, his writings, his publications, and so forth, and even some correspondence had taken place. Greenwell was the next link in the chain, and as we went down to California to evaluate this Redwoods video, at one point in the trip, he reaches in his briefcase and he pulls out Vance Orchard's Bigfoot of the Blues, the Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon and southwestern Washington. I was also familiar with the significance of this region because it featured so prominently the evidence, the footprints, the casts featured so prominently in Grover Krantz's work, given his proximity in Pullman, Washington. Walla Walla was just a stone's throw away. So he had really looked into that region closely, and it was a bit of a King Midas's empire. Paul Freeman and Wes Summerlin had a Midas touch. Lots and lots and lots of cats, and that raised suspicions. But anyone familiar with the region came to understand very quickly the soil in that part of the state and extending. I'm very familiar with it because it extends all the way across southern Idaho, clear over to my neighborhood. So if a new road is put in, or if a road is graded, or topsoil is removed, you expose these meters thick deposits of glacial loess. It's like talcum powder in a flour. It's extremely fine. So over there in the Blues, all of the foothill roads were simply graded trackways, or tracks, graded roads without any gravel improvements. They made excellent track beds. When they were wet, the soil was very clay. That fine particulate soil made a very clay, almost a gumshoe type of mud. But when it was dry, it was like flour. And if you've ever, sprinkled a little flour when you're making pizza dough or pie crust or something, if you take your finger and touch, you can leave a perfect fingerprint. That fine particulate size picks up that detail, the topography, remarkably well. And so here were all these tertiary roads that were unimproved, that were just natural truck beds. And if you ran those at the right time, you'd find not just Sasquatch. It wasn't like, someone was just this disproportionate Sasquatch representation that would suggest someone's planting tracks. No, I could take you up on there's this one saddle where the road cuts across the saddle between the Wanahatukanan Wilderness on one side and the Mill Creek watershed on the other side. So there's a lot of wildlife traffic up over that saddle. and this unimproved dirt road. And I can take you up there. I mean, because I did it repeatedly with press and so forth to make my point. And I could show you coyote tracks, even on a rare occasion, a wolf track, cougar tracks, deer, elk, sometimes a moose on a rare occasion. But I mean, it was just like a buffet, a plethora.
So it's not like it was a Sasquatch super highway for tracks. It was all sorts of wildlife.
Exactly.
No, but despite that fact, I just want to, for clarification, you mentioned that prior to your serious investigation into that region of the Blues where Paul Freeman made many of his trackway discoveries, and of course the Paul Freeman footage as well, and we'll get to that later. But you were, as a scientist, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were highly suspicious, and you hinted at it before, that the Midas touch, the fact that this one guy purportedly had captured so many tracks, you weren't convinced at all that these were legitimate, correct, initially?
Sure. I harbored some concerns, and I had also that they had been amplified by the opinions of people like Rene de Hinden, and even Grover Krantz was a little bit cautious, not that much. I was thinking actually John Green, I think, was influenced a lot by Rene, and so and didn't know Paul, didn't know the material firsthand really. And so he was a bit skeptical. If a person finds one set of tracks, it's kind of might be suspicious. He finds two or three or four, on these. If the more frequent the occasion, then the more suspicious it became, because John recognized these animals are extremely rare. Well, that's true, but all animals are creatures of habit. And if they have certain pathways, certain routes that they pursue in order to forage for game or water or cover, the necessities of life. Paul worked his butt off. It wasn't like he just stumbled on these things. He would go out, and especially after the first snows had melted away, as soon as the roads were drivable, because the snows would tend to push all the wildlife down into the lower elevations. And so as the snows are melting up, you've got this sort of boundary, this green up zone, everything's well watered and sprouting and fresh. And so the animals are kind of concentrated there. The springs are reactivated by the runoff and the increased flow into the water table and so forth. So as soon as the roads were drivable, Paul was out there every spare minute driving these roads and just looking for any place that a Sasquatch or any animal. He had some good casts of bear tracks and things in his collection as well, just to illustrate the contrast. But anything crossing the roads or walking along the shore of the road, he'd keep his eyes peeled for it. And after he captured the footage...
Oh, there he goes.
Jesus. The footage particularly, but even slightly before then, when he had the encounter while he was on patrol around the watershed and saw this creature walk down the bank and look at him, and the hair stand up on its shoulders and its head. And so he became something of a lightning rod. And people in town were talking about it. And so they'd say, oh, yeah, Paul, I was up on, yada, 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 and saw some tracks. You should check them out. And so he would, So he was getting all these references to locations to go look. And some of the stuff I've got it all in my lab here. And some of the stuff was clearly hoax. People, I think, were trying to hoax him. And he'd show them to me. He'd say, yeah, this one, I don't know. He said, but someone called me up or someone told me about it. So I went up and made it. He would always make a plaster cast no matter what. And it was only much later when he took me up to show me the footprints that he had discovered that day for the same reason. It was in February. The snows had just melted back off of this particular road up to the ridge above, and he was driving the circuit and came upon these tracks. And he tells me, he says, I wouldn't even bother with them. He said, I've cast so many footprints, unless the tracks are really pristine, perfect, I'm not going to bother. Well, I'm looking at these tracks, What he's calling imperfections are just the signs of animation, the toe slips, or the drag outs, the big toe dragging out, or the pressure ridge of a midtarsal break, all these types of things, the tension cracks, the splay, the smear of a toe spreading across or slipping down across the instep, that push off. And I just soaked it in. See, let him criticize all I want. So as soon as we took him home, my brother and I were together on this trip. A nice alignment of the stars. He and I were together when we went to the Patterson-Gimlin film showing, and then when we saw this remarkable set of tracks, he and I were together again. And I turned to him and I said, look, even if these are hoaxed, and by now I'd gotten an earful about Paul. So it was like, do we trust him or not? But I know tracks. But I can interpret a footprint. I can tell you about the underlying skeleton, about the interaction of the joints and the soft tissues spanning those joints. I can tell you about the dynamics, about the force generation, about the pressure release and so forth, the engagement of the toes with the substrate and so on. I can interpret those things. I can recognize them and interpret them and distinguish one type of track from another type, another species. And so I'm looking at this stuff and I'm thinking, how could it possibly do this? There's too much anatomical detail, which, as I would describe, point out the things that were impressing me. It was like, he didn't have a clue what I was talking about.
So you could tell, in other words, that Paul Freeman was unaware of what he called imperfections. What caused him to consider tracks unworthy of casting were the perfect clues you needed to determine that they were authentic and not hoax, correct?
Yeah. Right, exactly. And he didn't necessarily turn his nose up at other things. He had in his collection lots of examples of partial tracks there was this was such a great example, which I really didn't realize until I was writing the chapter in my book on the imprints of other body parts, including we've got a butt print that's just amazing. And the anatomical detail, the subtleties of detail that escape most people. There were handprints, and there were the infamous knuckle prints with the thumb jutting out to the side, and even a thumbnail, and you can feel the barbell shape of the condyle of the proximal phalanx. The subtlety of the anatomy is really amazing. Well, there was this one, he would sometimes show me a cast, and you could tell, he'd kind of go, I'm not sure. And he goes, I'm not sure what this is. He says, I just called it toes. It looks kind of to me like a vague imprint of 4 toes. And I thought, well, maybe, and I'll look at it later, and I stuck it aside. Well, on this occasion, when I was looking for these other things, including the handprints and whatnot, I pulled the drawer open, and here's this toe sitting here next to a handprint by coincidence. I go, and I pick it up, and I start to look at it with a slightly different frame of mind. And then the anatomy jumped out at me. It wasn't a footprint at all. It wasn't toes. What I was looking at was the imprint of the fleshy heel of the fist, and the toes were actually the knuckles, as that, it was probably resting on the fist as it got up. As it got up, the hand rolled across the knuckles like this. So the closest one, even though it was the little finger, was the biggest imprint. It was, like when you take your thumb and you're fingerprinting for whatever reason, and you roll that whole surface, then you end up with this square that seems like it's twice as big as your thumb, because the surface area that's wrapped around your thumb is now spread out flat. Well, likewise here, that little conical shape or rounded, it's an hemispheric shape with the knuckle was rolled so that it made this big, broad, deep impression. And then there was another. There were four knuckles. The thumb wasn't engaged. But the heel it was so obvious. Even these little Y-shaped flexion creases at the base of the little finger were visible to the eye. But he totally missed it. He totally misses. I missed it until I was looking at it with the right frame of mind, had the right eye for that detail, and then boom, the recognition set in. So yeah, so sometimes I would be pointing out details, or I would show him the midtarsal pressure ridge now. One of the traps in this trapway had this very distinctive speed bump pressure ridge. And I go, I've seen that somewhere. Like John Green had said, I seem to have an inordinate grasp of so many data points. Well, one of those was a picture from one of John Green's books that showed this photograph that was taken by Lyle Laverty, a timber cruiser for the U.S. Forest Service, at the film site on the day of. Well, maybe the day after, because Roger and Bob eventually made it back into town. Brouhaha in town talking about it as word, kind of gossip spread, and Laverty happened to be in town with his crew, got wind of this story, thought, oh, that's weird. We were just up there. Let's go take a look. So they went back up there, and the prints were still clear as could be. And so Laverty had snapped a bunch of slides, color slides, excellent photos of at least 5, I think, which ended up being cast subsequently by Bob Titmus. So we've got the photos of the individual footprints and then the casts now with it, including this very distinctive pressure ridge. And so it had been published subsequently, and I think it was in John Green's The Apes Among Us. And the 1 or 2 other places and pictures of that cast had also, but no one had really made the connection. No one had really identified what that pressure ridge was and the significance for the form and function of the foot. And so I'm looking at this footprint and then another and another. There were several there in the blues in 96. And I go, I've seen it. And sure enough, I went back and looked, and yeah, they were, I had made copies, made a footprint cast rather. And eventually I got a chance to go spend more time with not only John Green, but Bob Titmus and his collection, and was afforded the opportunity to pull a copy of that cast. The Titmus had come to the scene and had made casts of 10 footprints, which included several of those that were photographed by Lyle Laverty. I mean, there was just no escaping the fact that what this was, and that these were the same expressions of the same anatomical feature. And then might as well finish the stream of thought here. The real clincher to that, lots of interesting other correlated examples, but the absolute slam dunk clincher for it was when I went to China and had the opportunity to see a pair of casts of the Yarrow that were made by a park ranger, Mr. Yuan, after having seen the wild and then tracked.
And those were in Chenongjia Forest, correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
Word of them had been disseminated somewhat, but no one had drawn attention to the significance of this feature. So its presence on his casts was lost, didn't draw any attention. But when I gave him, we're in the bus going to the site to be interviewed. He had his little travel case, a little small travel case that had toweling and wrapping up his casts. They wouldn't let me take a peek until we got there. They wanted to capture on with cameras rolling my initial unadulterated reaction to the unveiling. But I had brought with me on the trip a 3D scan of the Titmus cast, but depicted in successively rotated positions, so you could appreciate that contour really well. But he turned the page, saw that large figure, and oh man, he just sat up. He grabs my jacket, he's pulling on it. He's going, stomping away at this picture. Okay. They won't let me look, but okay, just give it a minute. Sure enough, we get there and we're set up, and he's all excited, and he pulls out the suitcase and look. He lifts out this cast, and here's why he was so excited. They were both dead ringers for the Titmus cast. I mean, it was about a half-inch wider, just a little coarser in its robusticity. Maybe a young adult male instead of a adult female like Patty. But I mean, there was no escaping. They were the same feature. same proportions, same form and function. It was the same species. Then you look at the dates. This was cast in 1992. I hadn't even published my description of the titmus cast and the significance until the late 90s, you know? So how would he would have no inspiration. He would have no reason to single out that odd looking, because people see it and if they don't have any comprehension of the underlying form and function, it's like, oh, it must be broken. Or it's an arch. It's just a weird, wildly expressed arch. And I said, no, it's not an arch. And no, it's not. It's a dynamic feature. It's a pressure ridge. And then I show other examples. But then amongst the Sasquatch, I mean, and the blues, in addition to the tracks that I cast and witnessed, there were others that Paul Freeman cast that have that pressure ridge just as distinctly present. And, then there were other examples from other places. The Vosburg cripplefoot. Well, see, and then that dictates too, the presence of the pressure ridge dictates the location of the axis of flexion, which is determined by the position of the transverse dorsal joint made up of the talonavicular calcaneocuboid joints. Well, so in our reconstruction of the skeleton, if we have a pressure ridge, we know right where that axis of flexion has to be, right? Just in front of that hump.
Quick interjection here, because I know what you're probably thinking. Dr. Meldrum is describing in great detail this extremely specific anatomical feature, the midtarsal break, and the resulting midtarsal pressure ridge found in many of these purported Sasquatch footprints. But how can we even know what a morphologically accurate midtarsal pressure ridge looks like in the footprints of an unknown and unclassified species? It's a fair question, but there's actually a super simple answer. The midtarsal break is a feature not found in human foot anatomy, but it is found in the feet of every known great ape species, gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and so forth. Dr. Meldrum knows this much better than most because in his career he's dissected probably dozens of feet from these great ape species. So what Dr. Meldrum is doing is he's taking his knowledge of the midtarsal break in known great ape foot anatomy and extrapolating it, applying it to the purported Sasquatch footprints that he's observed. And the feature matches perfectly with what a highly trained anatomist would expect on an anatomical level.
Well, another key, if France's interpretation and mine to follow of the Vosburg cripplefoot is accurate, those bumps on the outside of the deformity, the deformed foot, are bunionettes, scar tissue due to inflammation about the deranged joints on the outside edge of the foot, just as grandma would get a bunion on the outside of her big toe pressed in unnaturally by tightly fitting pointy shoes. Those bunionettes mark the position of calcaneocuboid and the cubometatarsal joints. And so that position marks the transverse tarsal joint. And even though the Vosburg cripplefoot doesn't have a distinctive pressure ridge, it's not walking the same way, and obviously it's had some injury to its foot or feet, the other foot doesn't seem to betray any pathology or deformity resulting from an injury or from a neuropathy. I think it's a neuropathy. I don't think it's an injury. I think it's a spinal cord lesion, a tumor on the spinal cord. And that's the more popular consensus amongst the orthopedists and podiatrists. But in any case, those landmarks indicate the location of one of the joints that's part of the transverse tarsal joint. And it's located in exactly the right positional relationship, reflective of the elongated heel segment that forms greater leverage in the power lever of the foot, and is attested to in multiple other examples of a very robust elongated heel proportion. And so, I mean, how could this be purely coincidental? And it's not, because even if it were limited to just one, it boggles, as Dehinden would say, it boggles the mind to even contemplate the possibility. But to have, I mean, I can show example after example after example that show this distinctive morphology.
A common point of skepticism that I run into all the time in the comments section of my videos to do with footprints specifically has to do with the morphology that we're discussing and the midtarsal break specifically. People will say, people who don't understand the dynamic movement involved to create that artifact, they will say, well, that track has a midtarsal break, but apparently this one from the same set of, 10 casts or whatever it was, say the 10 Titmus casts, for instance, or the Freeman cast, why don't they all have that?
Yeah, there are the interaction of two factors. One is the consistency of the substrate. So whether it's going to fail and yield when the appropriate force is applied, whether it's a pressure ridge or sometimes it's a disc, the whole disc slides back. I should use the other hand. So there we go, because I was looking at my mirror image here. So sometimes a pressure ridge pushes up. Sometimes the substrate fails completely and the disc detaches and slides back like that. It also requires the proper forward impulse because there has to be sufficient backward force rather than just a downward force to displace something posteriorly. Now, I have an example where the creature stepped in the mud and it was very saturated. In fact, the footprint that's left is completely inundated now with water. But when it stepped, it wasn't a matter of pushing material back. It was material compressed and extruding out from underneath the foot and up between the toes, and around the edge of the foot. But there's this extrusion from it, like a little tidal wave of mud that just falls back. It's different than the force causing the material to hump up. And then sometimes you get these longitudinal cracks where if the heel's already up in the air, so there's nothing to compact that displaced soil. So when it humps up, it leaves these longitudinal cracks. You can see them on the Titmus cast. You can see them on the footprints that I cast, some of them in Freeman. Now, the other thing that's really that stops the gob, so to speak, in this case, is if you take my slide, which I've done, and in fact, there's I just came upon today, one of Cliff Barrickman's deep dives. I mean, you can find it in one of my talks too, where I talk about the footprint evidence from the film site. But I just happened to stumble upon Cliff Barrickman. He used these two figures of mine to very good effect, but he addresses this very question. Well, if there's one that Meldrum's so impressed with, and Titmus cast 10, how come none of the other tracks have a pressure ring? Well, here are the 10 tracks scanned in 3D, and then in the next slide, we just rotate all of them 90 degrees, and suddenly you can see the pressure ridge on 8 of the 10. Now, in some instances, it's just the way they're walking, the way the substrate is. They do end up looking quite flat, flat as a pancake. Well, if you have a human arch that concentrates pressure at the ball and the heel, the two ends of the arch, then you don't get a perfectly flat foot. Now, some skeptics look at the flat imprint and say, oh, well, look, it was made by a wooden plank. Well, that's one explanation, but go do it for me. It's on you then to demonstrate. And it's not so easy to try to even come close with a flat wooden prosthetic.
Well, I'd like to discuss that point a little bit because, again, it's a classic angle, and ultimately I think it comes down to a lack of knowledge and education on the very fine and minute details that you're talking about,
Right.
Which makes perfect sense when you dig deep enough. But what's to say, just to play devil's advocate for a moment, that a very smart skeptic, one who has perhaps watched a number of Jeff Meldrum videos explaining footprint morphology, could you explain why they wouldn't be able to fake this stuff even if they knew about it?
Well, a case in point, Dr. David Daglin, who wrote a book that was largely an attempt to debunk so much of this evidence, although he grew up quite interested in the subject matter. Apparently, he convinced himself that it was all just fanciful and without any factual basis. Matthew Crowley, aka the Tube, and he's a prominent skeptic and writes and experiments and so forth. Well, both of them tried to debunk this by various contrivances, and one was the latex rubber, a thick rubber prosthetic. Its flexibility, basically what happens then is that the front part of the human foot impresses differentially, and if the rest of the foot is up in the air, then you might supposedly get a pressure ridge. The problem is he provides you with a number of pictures. In no two of them is the supposed pressure ridge consistently in the same place. I won't say proper, but in the consistent place.
Which it would have to be if it were a real living creature, correct?
Exactly, because it's constrained by the proportion of the foot skeleton. Whereas Crowley's model is based on a flexible rubber prosthetic that can actually flex anywhere along its length, just depending on where the foot is positioned, how tightly it's strapped on, or if the toes have slid forward or back, and so the two principal pictures he shows, the pressure ridges in very different locations. It's inconsistent.
That's fascinating. That's essentially a giveaway. It's a signature of certainly an above averagely sophisticated hoax to even know to attempt a midtarsal break or pressure ridges created by one. Because we've all seen the images online of the rigid carved wooden feet. And, obviously someone like yourself would just take one glance and laugh. But it's interesting that someone with several layers more knowledge on footprint morphology tried and failed to recreate some of these very telling features.
Exactly. And when we look abroad and find more and more examples, whether it's half tracks, which is a running track in this case, that terminates at just the right place where the foot would be flexed. I mean, when you and I run down the beach at full tilt in a sprint on the balls of our feet, plural, we leave this short, abbreviated footprint. Looks like a little five-toed dog, kind of.
Right, because there's no heel.
Yeah, there's no heel. It's just the ball of the foot with the toes. But in the absence of a longitudinal arch to support the foot in that posture, the Sasquatch foot, when running, would collapse into flexion across the transverse tarsal joint and would leave a half track, which the axis of flexion would correspond to the transverse tarsal joint or joints. It's actually a compound of two joints side by side working in tandem because of the interconnecting ligaments. Those examples, time and time again, are just remarkably interesting. And again, documented at a time before anyone was privy to my hypothesis, my theory or interpretation. Put it that way. I think it's much more than a hypothesis because I'm quite confident in the interpretation. Why? Because I can watch it take place in the Patterson-Gimlin film. I can watch her foot do the very thing I have described. And
right, the heel lift, yeah.
Exactly. And so the very well accepted by those people who are in the know, not the diehard skeptics, but the Hereford track, Dennis Hereford, deputy sheriff, Grace Harbor County, responding to a disturbance at a construction site, a line of tracks, exquisite tracks because of the conditions. Hard pan with a layer of pulverized dust. It's not lust this time, but it might as well be because the heavy machinery just grinds the soil down to talcum flour or talcum powder, and then wet down by a rain so that as the foot stepped through that layer of moistened powdery soil and hits the hard pan below, the mud just extrudes up between the toes and out around the edge of the foot. You get almost a perfect outline of the foot, almost like a mold of the foot, rather than simply a footprint. And that's an important feature, and I've emphasized and it's echoed by Cliff repeatedly. A footprint is not a mold of a foot. A footprint cast is a record of the interaction, damage, if you will, distortion or disturbance of the substrate by the foot through the course of a step. And so,
Right. And well, in other words, it's a snapshot. Is it correct to say that it's a snapshot of different portions of the foot at slightly different instances as the foot pressed down to locomote the creature?
Exactly. But all composited together, so it isn't a true representation of actual shape and size and proportion, but it's a composite of that series of interactions. Sometimes there's distortion, sometimes there's slippage, sometimes there's expansion of soft tissue under pressure and rebounding, when pressure is released. All those things have to be taken into account when interpreting a footprint. Even its dimensions, because sole pads expand. The side walls press out as a sometimes very thick sole pad under compression expands laterally. We don't let it go too far. We have a lot of connective tissue there to hold that fatty tissue under the bony support. You don't want it all to spread out to the side, otherwise your bones collide with the substrate underneath. So, but still, there's distortion. There's drag-ins, there's slide-ins, there's actions of the toes, either splaying or flexing or even double tapping sometimes. They give an unusual appearance, even sometimes the appearance of 6 toes to a double tap of the 5th toe.
Well, speaking of the changes that you see in certain tracks as terrain changes, like you just mentioned, the toe splaying, for instance, or toe slide when we get to a small hillock with slippery mud, for example. Could you explain why that's another feature of a set of tracks, obviously not an individual track, but the change from one print to the next over a set of tracks where some have toe splay and why is that another thing that a hoaxer couldn't possibly replicate?
Well, because obviously, not necessarily obviously, but typically you imagine when producing footprints that are unhumanly large and distorted in their shape, you're going to be working with some kind of a prosthetic. And the most straightforward, obviously, because we've seen the suggestions of hoaxing by numerous people claiming the simplest, the most straightforward is a carved wooden plank. Create a rigid wooden foot that can be strapped to boots or to shoes or harnessed directly to your feet, I guess. And obviously, there are tremendous limitations to the immobility. There is also the problem of depth of imprint, because it's like putting on snowshoes. You increase the surface area of support without altering the mass that's being transported. Short of maybe donning a 65-pound pack. But even that, if you double the size of your foot, is for an adult, adult male that weighs between 200, 250 pounds, say, or 300, to double that, to put on 200 pounds, is the potatoes or something. Who knows what? It's still, or as we tried one time, me climbing on someone's back and riding piggyback while they were wearing these, in this case, it was a fiberglass shell with a set of old canvas high-top sneakers, then glued in with fiberglass in the boat of the shell. And oh man, they were uncomfortable to wear, though. You had to wear lots of thick layers, several layers of thick socks.
And I would imagine, I didn't know that you had attempted that recreation of the potential hoax process, getting on someone's back. That's hilarious, and also very telling about your scientific integrity in all this, because I think,
you need a researcher. See, this is why Paul Freeman got such a bad rap. He was labeled a hoaxer because he made a statement that he had experimented in his backyard with some carved feet in order to see what it would take in order to create a footprint, a convincing footprint.
Right. Yeah, people really latched onto that, didn't they?
And you have to weigh that, because seriously, really, any researcher worth their salt any student of tracking will have done those kinds of experiments in order to educate themselves. You know, it's one thing when you do it. I mean, the fact that he said he did it in his backyard, he didn't go down to the Lewis River or whatever, or the reservoir and stomp tracks out along the beach to see how people would react. Now that's what a hoaxer would do, to see how people would react.
Look at that.
Well, the more I scrutinized these footprints, I started to find examples of what can only be described as a midtarsal pressure ridge. That is a long story, and it's an interesting one, but it's been slow to be, and it still hasn't been fully accepted by my colleagues.
Well, that's a very interesting point, the fact that it still hasn't been fully accepted.
Yeah.
It seems to me, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that makes it all the more unlikely. In fact, it seems like the final nail in the coffin of the idea that such a feature, the midtarsal pressure ridge, especially during the 1960s, but even significantly later than that, would have even been in the collective consciousness of anyone who might have attempted a hoax of these footprints.
Exactly. No, that point is very well made. And then combine that with one of the most popularized snapshots of the footprint before Titmus cast it. It has there, adjacent to the pressure ridge, there's this bleached out white looking branch, springer of a leafless, needleless branch sticking out with several branches, several ramifications. And people looked at that and its proximity to the pressure ridge and said, oh, well, it just stepped on, say, a green bough, part of the debris. You know, there's that big debris pile there on the sandbar that Patty's walking behind. And it's conceivable there's a springy, still green branch just underneath the sand, which when stepped on would compress it down, but when pressure was released, it would rebound up and create speed bump, the hump. So it was thought that it was simply an artifact of that one particular step that's betrayed by the branch sticking off to the side, suggesting there's a buried green springy branch underneath the hump. Well, that would be fine, except that when you take all 10 and you turn them, they all have, in that exact proper position and orientation, they have the pressure ridge.
Perhaps those particular theorists would also like to purchase the Brooklyn Bridge.
That's right. Property, I tell you.
So I want to move over to other forms of evidence now, but just before we do, I think this is a point worth stating concisely. Would you say, in your opinion as a scientist, and specifically as an expert in primate locomotion and foot morphology, is it safe to say that the details in the footprints that we've been discussing absolutely confirm beyond the shadow of a doubt the existence of the Sasquatch species?
Well, in my mind, personally, yes, it does.
This is absolutely insane. Just to reiterate, the morphological signature left behind in many of the footprints that Dr. Meldrum has examined can only point to a real living Sasquatch. At least that's what it points to those who have the extremely detailed anatomical knowledge to see it. Trouble is, that's almost no one. Speaking of exposing uncomfortable truths, right around here is a great time to mention a podcast that you should absolutely check out. It's called Close Encounter Club, and it's run by two good friends of mine, Justin and Josh. They interview everyone, from astrophysicists who have had UFO sightings to everyday folks who have simply had unexplained experiences. And yes, they've got a top-notch Bigfoot series coming out very soon. It's deep, detailed, and the first episode in the series is actually an interview with me. So if you like the kind of logical, compelling analysis I try to bring you here, then you'll love Close Encounter Club. It's available on every major podcast platform. Check it out. It's definitely worth a listen.
I qualify that only by the acknowledgement that for someone who does not have the frame of reference, the experience with numerous specimens, and we're talking about footprints, we're talking about dissected cadaveric specimens, we're talking about the geometric morphometric analysis of hundreds of foot skeletons of primates and humans. I mean, when you take all that into account, that certainly has an influence on my ability to, with confidence, draw that conclusion.
Right.
Someone who doesn't have that in their back pocket, then they have to rely on the opinion, the conclusion, and I emphasize conclusion. I'll tell that one little quick story. One time I was on a radio talk show, and we were having a very similar conversation. And one of the other guests, I guess, or was it caller? I'm not sure which one. But one of the other was expressing her opinion. She was trying to counter my argument, my explanation for this functional arrangement and its expression in cases of footprint casts. And of course, I wasn't having it. She didn't have the wherewithal to challenge me on those points, was not offering substantial challenges or substantiated challenges. And then she kind of got defensive and said, well, that's your opinion. I have my opinion. I'm entitled to my opinion. You have yours. And I said, excuse me? I said, excuse me? I said, how many? And I went through the list. How many footprints have you examined? Have you cast? How many human cadaveric feet have you dissected? Better yet, how many gorilla, chimp, orang, macaque, baboon feet have you dissected in their entirety? How many foot skeletons have you measured? How many data sets, how many osteometric data sets have you contrived with explanations and rationale for the biomechanical basis of each of those measurements, each of those metrics? I said, when you've done that, you can equate your opinion with my conclusion. I'm expressing a conclusion based on all of that work, years and years and years of research and teaching and so forth. I said, it's not an opinion the way you're employing that word right now. It's not an opinion. It's a conclusion. Yours is an opinion based on a very superficial grasp of the material at hand.
Right. Well, and I think that's an important distinction to make because, correct me if I'm wrong, but the sort of opinion that you encountered there, the sort of opinion that anyone who calls themselves a serious Bigfoot researcher, not even those few who are at your level, but say at my level, anyone who receives such an opinion, it's obvious that those opinions are emotionally motivated, whereas a conclusion, I think this is an important distinction, a conclusion such as yours, that's motivated and informed by data, not emotion.
Yes.
Anyway, I cut you off there. Please finish your story.
I was just going to add that, she was quite disarmed and at a loss to defend her position at that point. And the moderator, thankfully steered the conversation in a slightly different direction. But she came up to me at our next encounter. She said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I hope I didn't offend you. We're still friends, aren't we?" I said, "Well, of course we are. Because my friendship's not based on our opinions. It's based on our friendship, our collegiality, and so forth." I said, "But it's an important point that you recognize this and you don't make that assertion again, because I tried to be polite, if blunt." I still tried to be polite, but hey, it might have been a little more bloody otherwise.
I want to talk a little bit about other forms of evidence. So we've talked about the fact that footprint morphology, the footprint evidence that we have in all its minute detail, informed by your years of experience studying primate locomotion, primate anatomy, anthropology, that in and of itself is sufficient proof of the existence of this species. And yet, folks who, as we were discussing before, who don't look at the footprint details through the highly experienced and nuanced lens that you do, will often be very dismissive towards footprints. You know, the thought process goes something like, well, I've seen a guy with fake wooden feet posing on a photo in the internet. It would be easy to strap on a pair of fake wooden feet, therefore all footprints are fake. And besides, if they were real, say the skeptics, we'd have physical evidence by now. We would have hair samples, we'd have scat, we'd probably have a body. And we don't have any of that, so therefore the footprints are fake too, because this species doesn't exist. However, that's not entirely true. The claim that there is no physical evidence, that no hair samples have been identified with very unique primate-like characteristics and yet not a perfect match with any known primate. So could you talk about the details of some of the physical evidence we do have and the studies that have been done on it?
Sure. So yes, in fact, we do have hair samples that are distinct. I mean, one of the things, basically, what we ended up with was this situation where hair was repeatedly sent in for identification. It would come back as, either they were unable to get DNA from it or it was indeterminate. A common conclusion drawn, indeterminate, cannot be determined as this, that, or the other. And when you understand the way hair typically, traditionally is identified, it makes perfect sense. The traditional method was to take, you'd have a library of samples of known hair, known species, and then you have your unknown, and you simply go in there and you compare it to these known samples until you get a match. Well, that required, for you to have then a confirmed Sasquatch hair, required that you be in possession of a confirmed Sasquatch hair to match it to. So that's missing. So you're left with this that doesn't match anything else, hence it's indeterminate. Well, my thought process was, and I compared this with some others, and one who had been thinking along the same lines was Henry Fehrenbach. If they're able to conclude that it is indeterminate, it is because it does not demonstrate or exhibit, rather, any of the characteristics that would allow you to match it to another known sample. So let's go back and see. I mean, they must have described the hair microscopically. Let's go back and see if we can resurrect some of these reports that just were brushed off as indeterminate and look at the basis for that conclusion. And sure enough, when we did, there would be a litany which involves things like the shaft shape. Is it parallel-sided? Is it tapered? What's the diameter, the average diameter? What's the scale, the cuticle structure? Are there any unusual pigment lozenges or pigment granules? Is there a medulla? How large is the medulla? How much of the shaft does it take up? Is it continuous? Is it vacuous? Is it whatever? Broken? Interrupted? Well, we did that, basically, and we got one description after another. And many of, not all, but many of these indeterminate hair samples were essentially identical to each other. They didn't match anything in the known, in the known library, but they were consistent within. That was interesting. That means there's something out there that for which a standard has not been established, but yet it's shedding hair that shows up consistently with these characteristics. And that became
the characteristics in question, correct me if I'm wrong, but although they didn't match any known species, but they did match each other remarkably well,
right.
It is safe to say that their closest relatives in terms of structural similarity were primate hairs, correct? Known primates.
Absolutely. And in fact, usually most closely allied with human, with very little exception to that. But basically, we're looking at a parallel-sided hair, so a very modified guard hair. A mammal fur consists of the larger, coarser guard hairs that are the outer covering, And then down interspersed between, but closer to the skin, is the under fur, the under hair, which is fine, very fine, sometimes even with a hollow acellular medulla. But it provides the thermal insulation, whereas the guard hairs provide mechanical protection against abrasion. So Sasquatch hair looks more like human body hair, which is a modified form of guard hair. And it has not a tapered tip, but rather tends to be parallel-sided, blunt-worn. It's fairly fine, 65 microns, which is about the average head hair coarseness of, medium coarseness of head hair. It has this often acellular medulla, meaning the central core, which is very apparent as a dark stripe in the hair under a microscope, which contains the remnants of the cellular processes going on in the follicle. That's where we find remnant nuclei and mitochondria, where DNA is most readily found. The remainder of the shaft, the cortex, is keratin, protein, an extracellular protein. Very durable, very persistent in the environment. Hair out that gets shed, well, it can blow around for years and years before it finally breaks down or gets, used in a bird's nest or some other material. You've seen those videos of the birds sitting on the dog's neck and plucking out tons and tons and tons of their big coarse guard hairs to go fly their nests with it. So those are the principal characteristics. 65 microns, parallel-sided, blunt-tipped wear, lack of a cellular medulla typically, or a broken medulla, and large lozenges of pigment, typically either eumelanin or pheomelanin. Eumelanin is black, dark pigment. Pheomelanin is the reddish-brown. So when you have,
which interestingly match the two most commonly reported colors among Sasquatch witnesses,
and everything in between. I mean, basically, if you imagine like a little etch-a-sketch with your dials here, if you turn up the blondish, reddish, you can go from kind of a buckskin pale color to a very reddish. If you at the same time start to increase the black, then you can get a light brown, a dark brown, and then a very black with red highlights, a mahogany kind of. And yeah, those are typically the color phases or variations that are most frequently reported. The most common color of a Sasquatch is dark, generically dark, or brown or black.
Right.
Tend to be much, on the darker end of the scale, but on rare occasions. I mean, I interviewed a witness who had repeatedly seen one he called a buckskin because because it had prominent visible breasts, was seen repeatedly. And buckskin, he would point to, he actually had a buckskin jacket hanging behind the door in a sequence, kind of a real tan color. So we have this gold standard. See, this is the thing. I have collected or had submitted to me samples that span from Alaska to Southeast Texas, and they are indistinguishable. If I lined them up, the only difference from one to the other is the slight change or difference in color phase. But the appearance, the physical appearance, the shape, the parallel-sided, the width of the shaft, the relative development of the medulla, and so forth, all those characteristics are remarkably consistent across the board. So that says that there's something out there shedding hair. That was the conclusion. John Napier, again, going back to John Napier in his book, he was convinced. In the end, his conclusion was that Sasquatch must exist. He said, because as far as he was concerned, it was interesting. I always found it gratifying that it was the footprints that were compelling. As an anatomist, he was most impressed by that trace physical evidence, anatomical evidence. And his conclusion was something is making footprints, real footprints, not, he'd already dealt with and dismissed the prospect of all this being hoaxed. Something is leaving footprints. Now, what that something is, he wasn't quite sure. He wasn't quite ready to come down on ape or hominin or whatever, at that point. But we can say the same thing. Something is shedding hair. This is not just, this is even less likely to be hoaxed. How do you hoax hair? I mean, unless you're going to the zoo and plucking out gorilla or orangutan, and most people are not qualified. Even fiber analysts these days do not go to the details of trying to differentiate even between, say, different ethnic groups of humans on the basis of their hair.
It's amazing how resourceful some closed-minded skeptics can be in coming up with potential explanations that aren't an unknown hominid species. So, how many samples are we talking about here, roughly, that just you personally have collected, and over what area? I mean, you kind of hinted at the answers to that, but what sort of variety?
Well, and I've honestly fallen behind Dr. Fehrenbach for the longest time. Dr. Fehrenbach is a now retired microscopist who worked at the Oregon Regional Primate Research Center. As a microscopist, I mean, in addition to working with primates, I mean, he was more interested in those aspects of primates that were microscopic, whether it was histology or something like parasitology was an important aspect. And Henner was our kind of go-to guy because he had access to excellent microscopic instrumentation as well as, electron microscopy and so on. So whenever samples would come to me, I'd always direct them his way. And that's why he had accumulated quite a lot of archival specimens of alleged Sasquatch hair. I knew another couple of researchers. There was a very good forensic anthropologist down at, I think it was University of Arizona, and he had an extensive collection of hair and had dealt with the claims of Sasquatch hair on a couple of occasions. So there were people out there like that. I'm an anatomist, whether it's gross anatomy or microscopic anatomy, it really doesn't matter. You're focused on particular morphology on the basis of size and shape and such. That determines the identification. So I have kind of stepped in where Henner stopped upon retirement and have yielded quite a number of, I've got, in fact, well, here's one right here. See,
Oh yeah, well, let's see.
When I get them, I label them very, very brightly as containing a hair sample, and then I've got a tub on the microscope table where I have these collated in their original envelopes to make sure that I still have, have the association with the donor's identity and location. And of those, I have to say, a large proportion, maybe 4 out of 5, can easily be attributed to other things, even to plants. There are some hair lichens that until you get down and you can actually see the nodes and the branching, they are easily mistaken for coarse hair. So I've dealt with that, dealt with lots of other animals and human. And the human are usually identified, again, by the clipping or by some chemical treatment of the hair. It's really not rocket science. That's the thing. It's pretty straightforward. A specific aspect, say, of the cuticle or medullary structure, and trying to put just the proper technical term to a particular manifestation. The hair I get are typically, 3, 4, maybe at most 5 inches. Every once in a while, there'll be some really extraordinary long hairs, but more often than not, there's from something like a cow's tail or a horse's mane. It's all too obvious when you just stick them under a microscope. Or in some cases, you don't even have to. You can just hold it up to the light. This was my big gripe. And, you hate to speak ill of the dead, but Peter Byrne, there was this big brouhaha about where the FBI announced that, yes, they had examined a hair sample that was attributed to Sasquatch, and they had determined that it was deer.
Right, and that's the classic rebuttal that skeptics give. The FBI checked it out, and it was all known animals, right?
Well, exactly, yeah, and that's my criticism is, first of all, I was amazed and quite delighted to hear that the FBI actually stuck it under a microscope, put it on a slide and stuck it under a microscope. I thought they would have just read, this could have come from a Sasquatch and, an unidentified primate, and would have thrown it away or just stuck it away in some dusty file. But unfortunately, Peter missed a real opportunity there because he could have stuck that hair under a microscope. He could have held that hair up to the light. And if he had been a little bit informed, I could have told you it was a deer hair just by holding it up to the light or by a 10-power loop, just looking through it. You would have been able to see the deer family are characterized by this very distinctive morphology of the medulla, where it's like whipped up milk, vesiculated, lots of little bubbles. It's like frothy down its entire length. It's quite distinctive. Like I said, you can just about make it out with your bare eye because it gives a very distinctive appearance, this lumpy, bumpy appearance to the medulla. Anyway, but what an opportunity missed. If we had been able to sand one of my gold standards, how would they have reacted? And would it have spawned some further interest?
Would it have moved the needle forward? Right.
Just like what was it? Was it musk ox? I always forget. In the Yukon area territories, fishing game up there did, in fact, look at it and published a paper. The Game and Fish Department, in one of their journals, published a paper on the debunking of this Sasquatch hair that turned out to be. And once again, see, it was the rebut. Well, yeah, anytime one of these alleged hairs is actually seriously examined by an authority, it's always identified as something common.
Right. Well, this is the common argument. Well, as you said, it's a shame that certain hair samples that you had examined closely didn't make it under those authoritative microscopes. Right. But it is very reassuring to know that the trope of all hair being simply misidentified from known animals clearly isn't true based on your own experience alone. So let me ask you, Dr. Meldrum, how confident are you in declaring that small percentage of the samples you get? You said 4 out of 5 are from known things or even from plants. So 20% are something that looks like an unknown, unclassified species, most closely resembling a human hair structure, but a little bit distinct from human. Mm-hmm. How confident are you in declaring that 20% of samples that you've looked at under a microscope as bona fide Sasquatch hair?
Well, taking it that step, going from these are not readily attributable or recognizable as any common form of wildlife, it's a big step from that position to 100% bona fide Sasquatch hair. And that's where the DNA analysis comes in, because that's where then you can make that leap, definitively make that leap, and land on the conclusion one way or the other. It's just that so far we've had this remarkable challenge that these hairs have not yielded DNA. And that has been first attributed to the lack of a cellular medulla. So in the absence of the cellular detritus, the remnants of nuclei and the nuclear genes and mitochondria and their genes, there's just precious little DNA to be found in the shaft of a hair. It's just extracellular protein. Now, we've had people who, this is where Brian Sykes came in, is he claimed that it was possible to clean the hair and then subject it to remove any extraneous potential contaminants and then digest it and free up any remnants of DNA that may be lingering in the shaft.
The Oxford study, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
The unfortunate thing about Brian Sykes, the Oxford study, is early on there were complaints that samples that had been submitted were never acknowledged, their receipt was never acknowledged, and then they weren't cited in the study. And I sent I can remember at least 4. I was talking about my gold standards from Alaska to Texas. Well, amongst those were some that were very promising. I went through the paperwork and submission process and submitted those. They were likewise never acknowledged, the receipt of or inclusion in or cited in the test. So
Well,
my
that's
concern,
certainly suggestive, isn't it?
yes, my concern was that any sample that did, because I had told Brian, we met. He was on a book signing tour when he was promoting his USA DNA book that had just come out. He was down in Salt Lake, and so he invited me down to have lunch with him and with his wife. It was a great opportunity to get acquainted, to chat and talk about this project of his and my research. Lunch turned into dinner. we chatted all afternoon. It was great. I mean, it was a great opportunity. But I offered my services. I said, look, you've got lots of things on your plate, I can see, and it's clear from our conversation. Let me help you out. Let me run some interference. I've already got a lot of experience with these samples. And you've told me that your biggest concern is you have limited funding and limited time and resource to do all these samples. I said, if you put out a general call, that's like kicking the barn doors wide open. You're going to get the whole barnyard in the barn. I said, let's narrow your focus. Let's laser beam your focus and let me screen and have you concentrate. There's always a risk we'll eliminate something that should have been included, but the likelihood that you're dealing with those that you should deal with is much, much increased as far as the numbers. No. We can't impose a bias, a preconception as to what Sasquatch hair is or isn't. And I said, well, if Sasquatch exists, it's a primate. It's not a mutated bear or something like that. So I said, it's a primate. So I think we're safe at imposing primate-like qualities. And so I'm not going to eliminate anything that's anywhere close to looking like a primate, but I'm not going to send you a deer or a bear, or a raccoon or whatever, a squirrel. Anyway, he wouldn't have it. So barn door wide open. And so I wasn't at all surprised when the paper was published and the litany of results encompassed the entire barnyard. He had everything under the sun represented in his sample, basis of his sample, but no Sasquatch.
Well, that's very interesting, and certainly with no intention of throwing shade at Dr. Sykes, but it does lead one to... Well, a little, sure, fair enough.
I think it was intellectually dishonest. If you publish a paper and you state that you had, let's just say, 100 samples, and of those 100 samples, you recovered DNA from 89 of them were identified as commonly known forms of wildlife. But isn't it curious? There were 11 samples that we were unsuccessful in extracting DNA from. And when we put those 11 samples under the microscope, they're all remarkably consistent morphologically. And they don't seem to match any common forms of wildlife. That would have been a very different conclusion coming from Brian Sykes, from the Oxford study. He stated they got DNA from everything. He simply excluded any sample that did not yield DNA. In the fact that I told him that that's been our biggest challenge, that he was assuring me that wouldn't be an issue. Our biggest challenge was that so many of these samples with an acellular medulla failed to produce any DNA unless there was some contaminant on the external surface from handling by a human, and which he was supposed to be getting by washing these things, both chemically and mechanically in a very thorough fashion, and then only DNA from within. So yes, a little bit of shame. That is a very different conclusion, and it's a dishonest conclusion. It gets you a book pretty fast, excuses you from a lot of work, but it's not intellectually honest.
Well, not at all. No, it's quite earth-shattering because anyone who's dug into Sasquatch evidence has, of course, heard of the Sykes study, and
Yeah.
it is, of course, an ongoing thorn in the side of any serious Bigfoot researcher. But to know that Dr. Sykes sat down with you and had the very real opportunity to include in his study a handful of
A
samples
handful of
of
samples.
that you had reasonable assurance were
Yeah,
of this relict hominoid variety,
right.
and he refused.
Yeah, I
That
had,
really puts a
yeah,
black mark on the entire Sykes study conclusion, doesn't it?
right. Well, I think so. I don't think it's a worthwhile result that furthers the investigation, that furthers the search at all. It becomes a distraction, just like the FBI case is nothing but a distraction. It doesn't help. It just provides, like you said, grist for the skeptic mill, and it's thrown back in our face. And yet still they can't account for those samples that morphologically the University of Ohio, no, Ohio State, Poirier, they were doing some DNA, and they had brought some Yeren, some wild Chinese wildman hair samples back with them, and were going to do DNA. And then they got cold feet because they were concerned that their results might be inconclusive. And if so, they could easily be misconstrued. You know, it's like saying, well, an indeterminate conclusion confirms that there is something unknown out there. And that's something
Right.
we all recognize as Sasquatch. And Ohio didn't want that to happen. So at the last minute, they pulled out of the manuscript writing with Henner Berenbach. And so I said, no, Henner, finish it. Just do it on the morphology. I mean, I'll back you up if you want me to. I'll get on there as well. And no, he wanted that. He wanted that brace, that crutch of the DNA to confirm his morphological observations.
Right, which, as you said, is much more difficult to pull out. Well, it's interesting and very telling, very suggestive that so many different, well, not so many, but several different attempts have been made to get a really good ironclad read on hair samples and DNA in conjunction. And it seems like through combinations of cold feet, reluctance to include perhaps the highest degree of upsetting potential for upsetting the apple cart of the paradigm of our understanding, those samples have been discluded.
Right. Yeah.
So there you have it. Just to recap, we have a serious, legitimate, and highly credentialed scientist who has spent decades studying every imaginable detail of the footprint morphology of these beings. And he says they absolutely cannot have been faked. They were made by real, living, unclassified creatures. And then there are the hair samples that were purposely discluded from studies purporting to determine if these came from Sasquatch or not. There were the individuals and organizations who got cold feet prior to doing said studies and refused to touch very likely authentic Sasquatch hairs. Dr. Meldrum observed these omissions happening directly. So honestly, who are the uneducated skeptics who don't have Dr. Meldrum's decades of field experience to disagree with him? They're simply unqualified to do so. Let me know what you think. Do you find Dr. Meldrum's conclusions compelling, or are you still skeptical and unconvinced? Either way, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. If you've ever wanted to be part of this search for the truth about Bigfoot, not just watching from the sidelines, but actually standing with me as I dig deeper, then I've just launched something just for you. My new Patreon is live, and it's built like a research team. You can sign up for free and still get access to behind-the-scenes photos and occasional polls. Those are open to everyone. But if you want to go further, sign up as a research supporter. For $5 a month, you'll get early access to ad-free versions of all my videos, exclusive behind-the-scenes photos, and exclusive polls. At the research participant level, $10 a month will get you all of that, plus behind-the-scenes videos, 10% off all exclusive Cabin in the Woods merch, full-length extended interviews, and voting power for upcoming video projects. To celebrate the launch, the first 100 members to sign up will get 20% off their first purchase of exclusive Cabin in the Woods merch. That's on top of the discounted prices already going on in the store right now. Those discounts are worth more than even the highest tier of paid membership. This really is the best way to support this work, get closer to true Bigfoot investigation, and help me keep pushing for answers. All links are in the description. I hope to see you on the inside. I'd also like to take a quick moment to thank my latest Cabin in the Woods channel members. Please forgive me if I pronounce any of your names wrong, but thank you to Kendricks Adcock, Bradley Kaler, Cody Reel, Oliver Hiley, Sherilyn DeMaio, Debbie, Diana Ward, Jolam, KW, The Paper Basket, Hand2 Adventures, and CJ Felt CS. Big thank you as well to my top-tier Cabin in the Woods Patreon members, Bigfoot Society, Frederick Linder, and Ribbon of Brine. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, share it with your family and friends, and subscribe to Cabin in the Woods. That helps me out a whole lot. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.